And point number 8 says, historically, the Lord descended from heaven to judge wicked nations. All right? Historically, the Lord descended from heaven to judge wicked nations. All right? So again, let us go back to our Bible and read our main text. It is 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 16. It says, the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise forth. And we're looking at this phrase, the Lord shall descend from heaven. This is what Israel, the remnant, were looking forward to happening in their time, in their day. Some of them had been preserved to see it happen. Jesus had said it will happen in their generation. He said some of them will be alive to see it. All right? And this was not a new thing for the Hebrew people. As we saw, David talked about the Lord descending from heaven with a shout. All right? So, as we said, historically, in the scripture, in the Hebrew scriptures, the Lord descended from heaven, and he descended not just to rescue, as we saw in Psalm chapter, in the Psalm with David that we just looked at there, but he also descended to judge nations, okay, to punish them for their wickedness. And this descent from heaven was called a day of judgment, or a day of the Lord, or a visitation of the Lord. Okay? So these days of the Lord, though described in similar language like what David used, using natural phenomena again, lightning, thunder, earthquakes, fire, smoke, brimstone, okay, volcano terminology. Even though they were described in these kind of language, they were never time-ending nor global destruction events. Obviously, because the planet is still here. These days of the Lord were always local to the specific nation, specific kingdom, or specific empire. All right? That was how the Hebrew people, that was how the scriptures, the prophets, all understood the day of the Lord not to be something that's global, not something that will destroy the planet, but it was always specific, it was always local to a nation, a kingdom, or an empire that God was judging. Right? And they were always the righteous ones, which he would deliver from these nations as well, and these kingdoms and these empires, right? But I'm more looking at the judgment aspect of it. For example, if we go to 1 Thessalonians 5, okay? Again, Paul writing to the Thessalonians, right? 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 1 to 4, okay? Look what Paul says. But of the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need. Now, remember, in the previous chapter, and I always make this point, that when Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, okay, he did not write a book or a letter divided up into chapters. He just wrote, like how we all write letters. Well, I don't know if we still write letters. We might write emails now. Okay? But when we write a letter or an email, we just write one thing from beginning to end. Okay? And our thoughts would flow. Okay? Afterwards, when these letters were canonized into the Bible, then they put in the chapter divisions. So here we are at 1 Thessalonians 4, First Thessalonians 5. We are in First Thessalonians 5, and First Thessalonians 4 is the previous chapter. That's how we would look at it. But really, all is just one flowing thought. So, all that has happened here, if we go back into First Thessalonians 4, Paul has just talked about the rapture, the Lord descending from heaven. That's verse 16. We which are alive and remain caught up together, so shall we ever be with the Lord. Then he says, wherefore, therefore, comfort one another with these words. And the very next thing he says is but of the times of the seasons, brothers, you have no need that I write to you. What times and seasons is he speaking of? What he just said there. The coming of the Lord, the descending of God of the Lord from heaven. Right? He says, that time and that season, you don't have any need that I write of you, because you know perfectly that the day of the Lord, so the rapture, 1 Thessalonians 4:16, would happen at the day of the Lord. Okay? And he says, you yourselves know perfectly. Now, that is something no Christian today can say. The modern church, which believes that the rapture is future, they cannot say they know perfectly that when it will come. They can't say that because so many generations have passed with people saying, oh, the day of the Lord is coming. Okay? But the Thessalonians and Paul, they knew that day of the Lord, it's coming as a thief in the night, but it's coming in their time. Okay? So let's follow what Paul says. You yourselves know that the day of the Lord so comes. He says, you know it's coming. You know it's coming, and you know perfectly it's coming. For when who's the they now? Who's the they? The they would be the enemies of the church. Israel. Okay? So when the enemies, Israel, was saying peace and safety, sudden destruction will come on them. Come on Israel. Okay? Sudden destruction was and sudden destruction did come on them. All right? But it's not like us today. Yeah, sudden destruction and years and years and years passing. No. This was Paul saying, Paul knew perfectly well. Knew perfectly. The Thessalonians knew perfectly as well. Why? Because they believed in the word of Christ, that these things were to happen in their lifetime. That's why they knew perfectly well. Sudden destruction would come on them as a travail on a woman with child. They shall not escape. All right? This was the certainty that Paul had and was communicating that certainty to the Thessalonian people. Okay? He says, but you brothers are not in darkness, that day should overtake you. Notice. Paul knew that the day of the Lord was coming to the Thessalonians in their time. How else could it overtake them? Right? And he's saying, because you are prepared, because you are faithful, and because you are trusting in the Lord to deliver you, the day would not overtake you. It would overtake your enemies. Good? So notice, the day was coming in their time. This would make no sense now if we stretch it out for thousands of years when those people have already gone off the scene. Generation after generation after generation have gone off the scene. Paul's words have no meaning anymore. But if we understand and if we receive the obvious truth here, that because the day was coming to them in their time, then there was a chance that it could overtake them if they were careless. It could overtake them if they lost faith. And it could only overtake them if it was coming in their time. That's the most important point I want us to see. Good? So the Thessalonians, Paul wrote to them that the day of the Lord, at which time there would be the rapture, because you remember, he's coming off of just telling them about the Lord coming to deliver them and to raise the dead. And then he says, but I don't need to tell you about those times and seasons, because you know perfectly well that the Lord is coming as a thief. He's coming in surprise. But even though he's coming in a surprising way, he's coming in your lifetime. So you still have to maintain. He was coming in their lifetime. So they had to maintain their watchfulness so that they would not be overtaken by said day of the Lord. Good? Now let's look at another example of the Lord descending from heaven. Okay? This time we're going to Isaiah chapter 13. Okay? So we're going back into the Old Testament. We're going back into the Hebrew scriptures, because what you need to realize that all these things that Paul is teaching and all these things that you find in the book of Revelation are all pulled straight out from the Old Testament. Because those were the scriptures in those days. The New Testament had not been compiled yet. The New Testament was just a bunch of letters that Paul sent, that Peter sent, that James sent, that John sent. And the Gospels. Right? None of that was compiled together or canonized, that we may say. So all they were pulling from the scriptures were Moses and the prophets. Okay? So we're down to Isaiah chapter 13 now. Okay? And we're gonna read not the whole thing again, but I'm gonna pull some scriptures again. You should read the whole thing at your leisure and your pleasure, right? But I'm just gonna pull some verses out. Right? Number one for the context. Verse 1. The burden of Babylon. Okay? That's the context. Judgment of Babylon. Okay? When the prophet uses this term, the burden of Babylon, he's speaking of the judgment of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Okay? So Isaiah was shown this. Let's jump down to verse 4. What was going to happen to Babylon? The noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts musters the host of the battle. So God, as it is said here, was bringing together an army against Babylon. Okay? A multitude, a big army. Verse 5 says, they come from a far country and from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Now, context. What land are we talking about here? Babylon, okay? The empire of Babylon. God was going to bring judgment to the empire of Babylon. Okay? Verse 6. Now look what verse 6 says. Howl you, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Notice. So the day of the Lord had come now to what? To Babylon. So again, the day of the Lord was not something new. When the apostles, when Paul wrote to the Thessalonians that the day of the Lord was coming as a thief in the night, and they knew it, it wasn't something new. The day of the Lord meant the day of judgment for Israel. Right? The day of judgment for Israel. And Paul says, you know perfectly well that the day of the Lord is coming because of Israel's treatment of God's people. Right? Look what he meant. He meant destruction was coming. An army was coming. What army was that? It was Rome. Rome was coming up against Israel. Right? But in the time of Babylon now, I believe it would have been the Medo-Persian army that God had been gathering against Babylon. Right? The day of the Lord. And notice, Isaiah said the day of the Lord was what? At hand. Now when Christians read this word at hand, all of a sudden we lose our minds and at hand becomes anytime, 1,000 years, we don't know. Okay. But when God says at hand, he means at least in the lifetime of the people to whom that message comes. Good? So when Isaiah would go and preach this message in Babylon, it would come to pass in the generation of the people to whom he was preaching it to. That's what at hand means. Okay? It makes no sense for God to say, look, the day of the Lord is at hand, and everybody who in that generation dies off, never seeing that day of the Lord, and 50 generations later, then is when that's when the day of the Lord comes. No. At hand means the people to whom the message comes to, they will live to see it. It will happen in their lifetime. And the day of the Lord, okay, was coming to Babylon. So as I said, the day of the Lord was nothing new. The Lord descending from heaven was nothing new. These were things that the Hebrew people knew and understand what it was all about. Good? Let's jump down to verse 9 to save some time, okay? Because some people saying that the studies need to be a bit short. You know what I mean? But anyway, behold, the day of the Lord comes. Okay? The day of the Lord was coming to Babylon. Cruel both with wrath and fierce anger to lay the land desolate. He shall destroy the sinners. Out of it was a judgment for the wicked people in Babylon. Right? Verse 10. Now look at verse 10. Look at verse 10. For the stars of heaven and the constellation thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Where have we heard this kind of language before? This is the same kind of language that Jesus would have used in Matthew 24, and Peter would have used, I think it's in 1 Peter 3 or 2 Peter 3, 1 Peter 3 or 2 Peter 3. But these are day of the Lord language. Okay? So again, the Hebrew people were not unfamiliar with these kind of language. Okay? And all this meant is that the light at the creation of the world, God gave light to the earth, right? But symbolically, light also means your spiritual understanding, your ideology, your religion, and so on. That's your spiritual light. And the fact that these will not be giving any light anymore, it refers to the complete destruction of that nation in terms of its the physical, not just the physical, like the buildings and fortresses, the palaces and so on, but also the knowledge and the ideology of that nation will also be destroyed. Good? I did a study on that already in terms of the new heaven and the new earth. That's the next one you need to go watch. Go look in the New Cosmos Videocast channel for the studies I did on the new heavens and the new earth. All right? So let's look at verse 13. Verse 13, we're skipping out a lot of this. He says, therefore I will shake the heavens. All right. Remember the context. The context is Babylon. So what were Babylon's heavens? Again, just what I said just now. Babylon's heavens was their spiritual understanding, their religion, their ideology, right? Their philosophy, right? God says, I will shake that. Okay? And the earth shall remove out of her place. Again, context. Babylon. This is talking about. So what God is talking about here is like, look, this judgment I will bring on Babylon will not only affect the earth, meaning the physical, the buildings, the land, okay, the people, but it will also affect Babylon's heavens, its religion, its ideology, and so forth, philosophy. That's what I said just now, okay? Same thing with the lights and so on of the heavens. Good? It's talking about that. In the wrath of the Lord of hosts, in the day of his fierce anger. All right? Let's go down to verse 15. Everyone that is found shall be thrust through, and everyone that is joined to them shall fall by the sword. Notice, this was an army coming through Babylon. That was the reality of what was happening. With all this language about shaking the heavens and removing the earth and all of that, the reality of it was, I believe it would be the Medo Persians which came through Babylon, destroyed it, right? Destroyed it, destroyed its religion, right? All the priests and so on of Babylon who were teaching whatever their religion was, they were killed. So those were the lights of heaven, of Babylon's heaven, right? Okay, remember this is happening to Babylon. So when he shakes the heavens, it's not the whole, not even the natural heavens it's talking about, right? Because you would know, there would be historical record if at any time the heavens were shaking. All right? It's not talking about the literal heavens. It's talking about the heavens of Babylon. Good? And the reality here, this is the reality, what is happening on the earth, where God said he would remove the earth out of its place, or the land. This is what was happening on the earth in Babylon. People were being killed by the sword. The children were being dashed to pieces. The women were being ravished. Verse 17, look what he says. I will stir up the Medes. Okay, so yes, it's the Medo-Persian army that God was using, right? To judge Babylon and punish them, right? And move them off the scene, right? Move them off the scene. Look, their bows, weapons of war, shall dash the young men to pieces, right? They shall have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes shall not spare the children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees, excellency, shall be as when God overthrew. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah is another time when God descended from heaven. Go back and read it. Go back and read the account of Sodom and Gomorrah. You will see where God says, let us go down and see. The Lord descended from heaven to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? And what did you have at Sodom and Gomorrah? Fire and brimstone. Good? And so here's what happened to Babylon. Verse 20, it says, it shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelled in from generation to generation, neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make fold there. And that is so correct. Because all you could find now of Babylon is the archaeological remains. But the whole place is just desert. Good? So we understand that the day of the Lord, when the Lord shall descend, there was to be a deliverance. I'm talking about 1 Thessalonians 4:16 now. There was to be a deliverance for the people of God, a reward for the people of God, but also punishment for Israel, which had been persecuting the remnant, the people of God. Right? When the day of the Lord came to Babylon, and this would have been like about 600 years BC, before Christ. 600 years before Christ, you had the day of the Lord coming to Babylon, where the armies of the Medes were brought up against Babylon, destroyed Babylon, destroyed Babylon's heavens. That's its religion. The lights in the heavens would be those who were teaching whatever Babylon's religion was, and destroy the earth. The earth was moved out of the place, meaning all the houses, the land, the temples, whatever structures that were on the land. That's the destruction of the heaven and the earth of Babylon. Similarly, a day of the Lord was coming to Israel in the time of the Thessalonians, in the time of the apostles, in the time of the early church. And in that day of the Lord, the Roman army was the one that will carry out the judgment. Right? The Roman army was the one that will destroy the temple, destroy Jerusalem, slay the Israelites. And God would rescue his people. Right? And at the same time, God would put an end to Israel, put an end to the reign of death. That's why you can have the resurrection. Right? Yeah. That was what 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Thessalonians 5 were talking about. All right?